Hello again, this is Dr. Robert Guthrie. It's a pleasure to be back with you, sharing our scholarly Bible study, which is our continuing Sunday school lesson. We're working our way through the middle part of the Old Testament. We're going to be reading 2 Kings 18 to 21 and different chapters in Isaiah 20, 32 and 33, 36 to 39. This is an interesting and challenging and complex part of the Hebrew history. If you remember, the northern kingdom was conquered by the Assyrian Empire, a nasty, aggressive empire in 721 BC. And we pick this up when King Hezekiah becomes the king of the southern kingdom about 686. I guess that's when he died, about 705, 710 BC. Things had changed a lot because the northern kingdom was now gone. The Assyrian Empire was ascendant and nasty and very successful. And the Assyrian Empire had actually, like I said, had conquered the northern kingdom, had rolled down, conquering the coast of the eastern Mediterranean down to where Israel is now, modern Israel, and down into Egypt, even conquered Egypt, which is extremely rare in ancient times for any outside power to be strong enough to conquer Egypt with its large population clustered along the Nile River. And Hezekiah comes in as the new king, and he is one of my two favorite kings of the Old Kingdom, because he says, we've got this all wrong. We're doing this wrong religiously. We have tolerated all this paganism, and it's set us up to and he's listened to the prophet Isaiah, who said, God is going to punish us for these sins if we don't purify our religion and clean all this out. So he institutes a cleansing program to get rid of all the pagan influences. We've talked about, since this began, the 700-year war between the Baal Ashtart fertility cults and the Yahweh cult, the faith of our one God. And this is one of the major battles of it. So he decides he's going to try to win it. So he clears out the idols that had been put in the temple. Can you imagine? They take graven images, idols of the pagan gods, and put them in God's holy temple. And he took those out and threw them away and destroyed them. He sent people out to the high places. The tradition of the fertility cults is that they would celebrate in various unofficial, semi-official is a better way to put it, high places on the various mountains around the area, more big hills in that part, and then they'd have fertility worship, and they'd had dance around poles, the fertility poles, like the maypole was in Europe. And he closed all those down, cut down all the poles, destroyed all of that, and he was dramatic, and he really meant this. And Isaiah was supporting him at this time, saying, you've got to continue to do this. You've got to stand firm with the Lord, and God will take care of you. Now, but Isaiah's a bit different, and I mentioned this last week and got a comment from one of our regular participants about this. Isaiah has a very different approach of the covenant with the Lord, Yahweh, whatever you want to use the name. The prophets of the northern kingdom, Amos and Hosea, are the two that come to mind. They were always saying, we need to get the northern kingdom of Israel to go back to the basics of the Mosaic covenant. One God for us, our only God, no idols, faithfulness to God, and to God's rules. Isaiah never mentions the Mosaic covenant. Never. I'm certain he knew about it, but he never mentions it. He keeps turning back to the promise that God had made to preserve the royal line of the descendants of King David. So he sees the covenant as between the descendants of King David and their kingdom, which is now Judah, the southern kingdom, and the Lord, not the Mosaic covenant. It's very, very interesting. I don't know whether it means much more than that, but it's very, very interesting, and it's fascinating. And why did this happen? I do not know, but it did. When you look at Isaiah's writings, that's a very fascinating thing. After this various other campaigns, the Assyrians come up. We talked about this last week, but I'll go over it again. Come up to the to the gates of Jerusalem, And Hezekiah had got ready. He had fortified Jerusalem, built the walls up better. Jerusalem sits on limestone. Limestone is very soft and easy to quarry and carve into blocks and build walls with. He had built a tunnel through the rocks where they clearly had been following a crack. As I used to be able to go through it when I was in Jerusalem, 1968. You could walk through the tunnels. The water was about up to my mid-thigh, and go through the tunnel, and it curved, so they were clearly following a crack in the rock, and this opened a wall through the rock from the spring outside into the city of Jerusalem to preserve the water supply. Siege technology, you have to have a way to preserve the water supply, particularly in the Middle East. So he was ready for it. Assyria, he would do the best he could. Assyria comes up to besiege Jerusalem. It's a very interesting story we talked about. They have people in the Assyrian army who could speak Hebrew, whatever Hebrew was in 700 BC. It's different than it is now, of course. These are probably people from the northern kingdom who had been captured 20 years before, and they had turncoat. They're always turncoats in any situation. And they had come up, and they were trying to persuade him to surrender in Hebrew, because they knew that the people inside the walls could hear them and understand them, and they hoped to dispirit them, get them to convince them to give up. And the people inside, Hezekiah's people, tried to say, don't talk to us in Hebrew, talk to us in Aramaic. And they said, we're going to talk to you in Hebrew. And that was the end of the negotiation. Isaiah comes out. He had gone into retirement. He's come back out, and he basically gets half naked and parades through the streets of Jerusalem. And he says, don't surrender. God will preserve us. Hang in there. Don't surrender. The Lord will take care of us. In spite of all our sins, in spite of all our transgressions, in spite of all the corruption that you had to clear out, God will be faithful and will preserve us. And the Assyrians will collapse, and Sargon will die by the sword. Sargon was the Assyrian emperor at the time. So they just hang in there, and one morning they wake up, and the Assyrians are gone. Nobody knows exactly why. There's several different speculations. When I first read it as a physician, it seemed to me like they had a bubonic plague epidemic inside the Assyrian camp, because that'll kill you. Plague can kill you in 24 hours, and which is much quicker than the other things like smallpox and all that. And it's highly lethal. Smallpox is only lethal about 30% of the time. And so to me, it sounded like a bubonic plague epidemic inside there, because it's carried by rats and the fleas. The scholars that I've looked at, they think Sargon got wind that there was big trouble back home in Nineveh, and he took off to save his own skin and to pull his army back to Nineveh. The Syrian Empire by this time, like all empires, has overexpanded. Empires just keep doing it. They stretch themselves out. He was ruling from Babylon all the way to Egypt. That meant he didn't have enough manpower to maintain it. They're being attacked from the north by these tribes coming in to try to loot them. They're being attacked from the east by the Medes, who are up in the Iranian area now. They're trying to attack it. He's got all this wealth. Everybody wants to steal it. So he goes home, and there's all this unsettled nature, and he gets murdered by two of his sons. Okay. And then they take off they flee, and another son takes over. Remember, these people had large numbers of wives, large numbers of kids. They probably didn't have much of a relationship with their sons, and your sons were your biggest threat. Your brother was a big threat, your uncle was a big threat, male relatives, and of course your generals are a big threat. And you succeeded by killing off the people. They probably didn't have much relationship, so getting killed by your kids wasn't all that unusual in this day. So the fact that Isaiah did predict all this, he gets it right on the button. And so Hezekiah dies in 686, a very successful king. One thing he was very smart about is there were a series of revolts against the Assyrian Empire periodically, and he did not join them. He did not defy the Assyrians. He paid him money to leave them alone, and he laid low and stayed out of the fight. And you can let the Assyrians fight each other and fight the Egyptians and all that. He's in his small mountain kingdom. He hides behind his walls, keeps his mouth shut, and behaves himself. He's actually very smart. Don't attract attention when you're not all that strong. He's succeeded by one of his sons named Manasseh. And Manasseh plunges the kingdom into a dark age, theologically. He is the exact opposite of his father and the exact opposite of his son, good King Josiah, who succeeds him. We'll talk about him later. And he completely reverses his father's policy. Now, people think he was doing this to try to please the Assyrians, that he re-corrupts all the worship. He brings idols back into the temple. He says you can worship Baal and Ashtart and Yahweh all at the same time and blend them all together. He restores the high places. Let them put the poles back up. Let them do the fertility cults. He allows sacred prostitution, which had been banned for a long time. He even restores necromancy, which is calling up the spirits of the dead. Remember, this was banned since the time of King Saul, about 500 years before. He started up human sacrifice, which again is absolutely not a part of the Yahweh faith. Never in the Yahweh faith has there been any hint of human sacrifice. It was actually fairly widespread in much of the ancient world. And he even introduced Eastern things of worshiping the moon god and the sun god and all these other things in addition to Baal and Ashtoreth. You want to blend all of this in one big glop, and you can worship whatever you want. And it was not unpopular. And this was very easy. It didn't demand anything of people. You go out and do these fertility things. You can have all the sex you want. You can do anything, and we'll promise all this stuff. And he even sacrificed one of his own sons in the human sacrifice. I mean, this is an absolute heretical, abysmal behavior on the part of a monarch. Isaiah disappears in his reign. Now, whether Isaiah died a natural death, whether his security forces rubbed Isaiah out, they probably would have if they needed to. We don't really know, but he apparently had very severe security forces, and he drove the Yahweh worshipers down into obscurity. Now, they continued. Probably the most of the population was happy with this. Free will, free love, K-pasta, do whatever you want. There was a core of Yahweh believers led by the Levites. The Levites, of course, are the heretical priests and scribes going back to Aaron, and they preserved the Yahweh faith, and they probably had enough sense to lie low and not antagonize these people. There were other anonymous prophets that we don't hear about, or anonymous teachers that we don't hear about, who preserved the Yahweh faith. There is no emergence of a major prophet like Elijah. Elijah, when you had Ahab and Jezebel in the northern kingdom doing the same thing, Elijah came out and took them on in the name of the Lord and embarrassed them and all that. You don't have that here. Whether it wasn't in God's timing, whether it was the security forces of Manasseh, we really don't know. The Isaiah writings were preserved, and it's an interesting wrinkle. Is all the Isaiah writings from Isaiah? Probably not. There's clearly 3 sections to Isaiah. 1 through 39, first Isaiah, 40 to about 43, to about 53, 55. Second Isaiah, which is done in the Babylonian exile, all the messianic prophecies are in there. And then third Isaiah, which is after they came back from exile. Remember, they compiled these books into a set length that you would fill up a scroll, and they would store the scrolls in the ark. So there probably are other people added in to the Isaiah teachings to fill up the scroll, because you had these 3 different segments. So whether the Isaiah writings that we see at the end of Hezekiah and Manasseh are the original Isaiah, we really don't know. Now, there is one interesting thing in there at the time of Hezekiah that I forgot to mention, that he says that there will be a new and saving king that will be born. Now, when you look at this in the short term, this is probably a reference to his grandson, King Josiah, who was an even better reformer than he was. But from the Christian perspective, it's the hint at a Messiah. Now, remember, the concept of Messiah doesn't emerge until they're in the Babylonian exile, but you find these hints, the hint in Micah about the root of Jesse, the hint here about the son to be born, the early part of Isaiah, the maiden will have a son. So you find these hints there that we can look back on hundreds of years later and see hints of the Messiah to come, which is our perspective here. And so we're going to wrap up with Manasseh, and he probably did these things, corruption of the fertility cults, to please the Assyrians, which was probably unnecessary as long as you laid low like his father and didn't spit in their face and other things like that and rebel. They'd probably leave you alone. So maybe he really believed this stuff. He didn't. Maybe he wanted to get free from the restrictions of what the Yahweh faith would allow you to do, and he went wild on this. But in my opinion, he should have laid low. So that finishes this lesson. We're going to move on into 2 Kings 22 and 23. This is the beginning of good King Josiah's reign. Going to a new prophet now, Jeremiah 1 through 3, just the beginning of Jeremiah. He'll go on for a long time. Two of the short prophets of the minor prophets from this time, Nahum and Zephaniah. And we'll read those next week, and we'll move into the rediscovery of the Deuteronomic reform, where they rediscover the Torah, the story of Moses and the covenant, and they put this back in the belief system of the Southern Kingdom. This is Dr. Guthrie. It's been a pleasure. See you next week.
Wow.